Steve McQueen wasn't just a movie star. He was a myth, the king of cool, the rebel every man wanted to be and every woman wanted to tame. But here's the truth. The man behind the wheel in Bullitt and the daredevil who flew over barbed wire in The Great Escape lived a life more dangerous, more chaotic, and more mysterious than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. Because Steve McQueen carried secrets, powerful, destructive, and sometimes deadly. And some of those secrets were buried so deep, he took them to the grave. Now stop for a moment and think about that. We celebrate Steve McQueen for his confidence, his style, his untouchable swagger. But ask anyone who knew him closely, and they'll tell you, there was another Steve, a man haunted by demons, by paranoia, by scandals, and by the constant fear that the truth about him would destroy the image he worked so hard to build. So what were those secrets? Why did the FBI keep tabs on Hollywood's biggest star? What did his closest lovers discover that they dared not speak publicly until years after his death? And why did McQueen, the ultimate symbol of toughness, hide the most vulnerable battle of his life from the world? These aren't the kind of glossy magazine stories Hollywood wanted you to hear. These are the dangerous truths that Steve McQueen buried under charm, horsepower, and smoke-filled nights. They were hidden in FBI files. They were whispered in backlot bars and late-night parties. They were covered up by the studios who knew exposing them would shatter the legend. And yet, even today, enough pieces of the puzzle remain for us to start uncovering them. By the end of this video, you'll see Steve McQueen like you've never seen him before. Not just as a superstar, not just as the king of cool, but as a man who lived a double life. A man whose appetite for danger extended far beyond the screen. A man who made enemies in Hollywood, who destroyed relationships, who walked into the arms of addiction, who broke laws, and who finally, when faced with death itself, chose secrecy over confession. And here's the twist. McQueen didn't just protect his secrets to guard his own reputation. He protected them because the truth was even more explosive than the image. If the world knew what really went on behind those blue eyes and that stone-cold stare, the king of cool might not have been remembered as a legend. He might have been remembered as a warning. So buckle up, because in the next few minutes we're pulling back the curtain on the dangerous secrets Steve McQueen carried with him until the day he died. Secrets that still make Hollywood uneasy. Secrets that reveal the man behind the myth. And secrets that prove that sometimes the coolest men in history are also the most haunted. On the surface, Steve McQueen seemed untouchable. To audiences across the world, he was the definition of cool. He barely needed to speak a line of dialogue. His presence alone carried the screen. The squint of his eyes, the slow drag of a cigarette, the effortless way he leaned against a car. McQueen didn't play characters. He embodied a fantasy. Hollywood marketed him as the rebel who lived life on his own terms, the loner who could walk into a room and instantly command it without raising his voice. But here's the catch. That was the Steve McQueen the world was allowed to see. Behind closed doors, the king of cool was far less calm, far less stable, and far more dangerous than anyone suspected. For every movie premiere where he seemed in control, there were nights of paranoia where he refused to leave his home. For every sleek car chase he filmed on set, there were real-life moments where he drove recklessly through Los Angeles streets at speeds that could have killed him or anyone in his way. McQueen was a master of contradiction. He played the calm, collected hero on screen, but insiders described him as restless, suspicious, and fiercely insecure. He carried firearms almost everywhere he went, not as props, but as part of his daily life. Friends and co-stars whispered about his obsession with control, not just of his films, but of the people around him. His need to dominate extended into every corner of his world, his relationships, his contracts, even the tiniest details of his wardrobe. Why? Because McQueen feared being exposed. He feared the world would discover that behind the charisma and the fame, he wasn't untouchable. He was vulnerable, impulsive, and sometimes reckless. And so he worked tirelessly to maintain the mask of cool. If someone threatened to disrupt that image, whether it was a rival actor, a journalist, or even a romantic partner, McQueen shut them out, fought back, or buried the evidence. And here's where it gets interesting. The studio executives and Hollywood power players who promoted McQueen's movies knew about some of his darker habits. They knew about the fights, the addictions, the paranoia. But rather than expose him, they covered it up. Because the myth of Steve McQueen was worth millions. The danger, the rebellion, the unpredictability, it sold tickets. And so, his secrets weren't erased. They were hidden, left to simmer beneath the surface. This is why the public never saw the private McQueen. They didn't see the man who locked his doors at night and kept a shotgun by his bed. They didn't see the man who suspected enemies around every corner, even in Hollywood's golden circle. They didn't see the man who, even at the height of his fame, knew the FBI was watching him. That's right, Hollywood's biggest star was also a man under government surveillance, a man with a file in the hands of the most powerful investigative agency in America. And that file contained secrets that could have changed how the world viewed him forever. And in the next section, we'll open it. When Steve McQueen was at the height of his fame in the 1960s and 70s, he wasn't just on Hollywood's radar, he was on Washington's. While fans lined up to see Bullitt and The Getaway, agents in suits were quietly building a file on him. A file that would reveal just how dangerous America's most famous actor seemed to the government of his time. Why Steve McQueen? To understand, you need to remember the world he lived in. The late 60s and early 70s were a time of protests, counterculture, and rebellion against authority. Hollywood wasn't just making movies, it was shaping political opinion, and stars had influence far beyond the screen. McQueen, with his rough edges, his love for motorcycles, and his anti-establishment attitude, was the perfect symbol of rebellion, and that made him a target. Reports suggest that McQueen's name came up in FBI surveillance linked to political movements. He was rumored to have connections with counterculture figures, attended rallies, and spoke openly about his distrust of government power. According to some insiders, McQueen even received threats after the tragic assassination of Sharon Tate by the Manson family, an event that shook Hollywood to its core. In fact, he was reportedly on the list of potential targets. For the FBI, this wasn't just about an actor. This was about a man who embodied the idea of rebellion at a time when rebellion was viewed as dangerous. The irony, of course, is that McQueen didn't see himself as a political man. He wasn't out giving speeches or writing manifestos. But the government didn't need him to be a leader of a movement. He was a symbol, a face that represented the rejection of authority, the rise of the loner, the man who lived by no one's rules. And in those years, symbols were as threatening as words. Imagine that for a moment. While the world saw Steve McQueen as the coolest man alive, the FBI saw him as a potential risk. Somewhere in Washington, a folder existed with his name on it, documenting his movements, his habits, and his circle of friends. He wasn't just being followed by paparazzi, he was being watched by the government. This only added to the paranoia he already carried with him. Friends later recalled how McQueen was never fully comfortable in public, how he suspected enemies in places where most of us wouldn't think twice. Was it simply his nature, or was it because he knew, deep down, that eyes were always on him? Here's the chilling part. Much of that file remains hidden. We'll never know every page of what the FBI tracked, who reported on him, or how deep their suspicion went. But the very existence of that surveillance proves something Hollywood never wanted to admit, that Steve McQueen wasn't just a movie star. He was considered a threat. And if the FBI suspected him of being dangerous, what else was McQueen hiding from the rest of us? Because while the government tracked his movements, Hollywood was hiding an even darker truth, one that played out in his love life, his affairs, and the scandals he worked desperately to keep buried. Steve McQueen didn't just live dangerously on the racetrack or in back alleys. He lived dangerously in love. If Hollywood crowned him the king of cool, it also whispered about him as the king of affairs. Women were drawn to him like moths to a flame, but every flame burned, and some burned down entire relationships, reputations, and careers. On screen, McQueen's chemistry with actresses looked effortless. Off screen, it was often real and often explosive. One of the most infamous affairs was with actress Ali McGraw, who left her husband, legendary producer Robert Evans, for McQueen after they filmed The Getaway. The scandal rocked Hollywood. Evans was one of the most powerful men in the industry, and McQueen's audacity to steal his wife wasn't just personal, it was professional suicide waiting to happen. Yet McQueen didn't care. He pursued McGraw with the same reckless determination he showed behind the wheel of a Mustang in Bullitt. But Ali McGraw wasn't the first, and she certainly wasn't the last. McQueen was rumored to have had flings with Faye Dunaway, Natalie Wood, and countless others. Some of these stories made the gossip columns, but many remained carefully hidden, whispered only at Hollywood parties or in quiet corners of studio offices. What made these affairs dangerous wasn't just the broken hearts. It was the enemies McQueen created along the way. For every woman he conquered, there was a husband, a director, or a producer left humiliated. In an industry built on fragile egos and powerful connections, McQueen was playing with fire. Even his marriages were filled with scandal. His first wife, Niley Adams, later admitted that McQueen's infidelity was constant and unapologetic. She described nights where she would discover his affairs, confront him, and still find herself unable to leave. McQueen's magnetism was that strong, but so was his need for control. His love life wasn't about romance, it was about dominance, about proving he could take what he wanted, when he wanted, no matter the cost. And the cost was high. His marriage to McGraw was just as tumultuous as his affair with her had been. Friends recalled screaming matches, slammed doors, and long silences that lasted weeks. But for McQueen, scandal was never a reason to stop. It was almost fuel. He seemed addicted to the chaos, to the adrenaline of chasing forbidden relationships. Hollywood worked hard to downplay these stories. Studios didn't want their leading man branded as reckless or cruel. They needed audiences to believe in the fantasy, the cool, collected McQueen who could have any woman but never lost control. The truth was far messier. Behind the legend was a man who destroyed relationships like he wrecked cars, spectacularly, publicly, and without much care for the aftermath. And the dangerous part? These weren't just personal scandals. They affected his work, his friendships, and his rivals. They fueled his paranoia. Because every affair, every betrayal, created someone else who might want revenge. Someone else who might talk. Someone else who knew a piece of the truth he wanted buried. The result was a man constantly looking over his shoulder, even in the moments when he seemed most confident. His affairs weren't just love stories. They were landmines scattered across Hollywood waiting to explode. But as dangerous as his affairs were, they were nothing compared to another secret Steve McQueen worked to hide: his obsession with speed, racing, and the addictions that threatened to consume him. If Steve McQueen's love affairs were reckless, his love for danger was downright lethal. Hollywood called him the king of cool, but behind that calm exterior beat the heart of a man addicted to adrenaline. For McQueen, movies weren't enough. Fame wasn't enough. Even money wasn't enough. He needed speed, he needed the rush, and he needed it in ways that constantly put him one breath away from disaster. McQueen didn't just act in car chases, he lived them. Off-screen, he was a fierce competitor in racing circuits, whether it was motorcycles or cars, pushing machines and his body to their absolute limits. Friends recalled how he treated racetracks like playgrounds, casually risking injury, reputation, and sometimes even his life just to feel that pulse of danger. He wasn't playing a role. He was proving to himself, and to anyone watching, that he was as fearless in real life as he was on film. But speed wasn't his only addiction. The darker truth was that McQueen also indulged in alcohol, drugs, and the party lifestyle that Hollywood in the 60s and 70s practically encouraged. He used them to cope with paranoia, to drown his insecurities, and to fuel his restless energy. People close to him often described nights that spiraled out of control, wild parties that ended in fights, benders that lasted days, and mornings where McQueen would walk onto a set looking like he'd been through a war zone. What made this dangerous wasn't just the substances. It was the way McQueen combined them with his other obsessions. He would drink, smoke, party late into the night. and then wake up and climb onto a motorcycle or into a car, ready to tear down highways or racetracks as if nothing could touch him. The combination of speed and substances made him volatile, unpredictable, and terrifying to those around him. Yet somehow, Hollywood covered it up. Studio executives needed their star to shine, not crash and burn. When McQueen partied too hard, stories were buried. When he risked his life racing, it was spun into part of his legend. The man who could not be broken, the king of cool who could walk away from anything. But those close to him knew the truth. They saw the crashes. They saw the scars. They saw how the addictions were slowly eating away at him. McQueen may have been cool on screen, but off-screen he was spiraling, chasing bigger highs, faster speeds, and darker thrills. His life became a cycle. Push the limits, crash, recover, repeat. Every time, people wondered if the next crash would be his last. And perhaps the most chilling part? McQueen didn't seem to care. Friends recalled him saying things like, "I live for myself, and I answer to nobody." He wasn't interested in slowing down, in changing, or in facing the damage he was doing to his health and his relationships. To him, danger was a way of life, but danger has consequences. And for McQueen, the greatest secret of all was that beneath the image of invincibility, his body was breaking down. He was fighting a private battle that no one in Hollywood, not even his closest friends, fully understood. Because while the world saw Steve McQueen as unstoppable, the truth was that he was living on borrowed time. For all his bravado, for all his talk of living dangerously, Steve McQueen had one battle he couldn't win, and one secret he worked desperately to keep out of Hollywood's glare. Behind the sunglasses and swagger, McQueen was quietly fighting a disease that would claim his life, mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive form of cancer. It's important to remember that McQueen was a man obsessed with control. He controlled his films, his relationships, his image, everything. But when illness struck, it stripped him of that power. He began to lose weight. His skin grew pale. The man who once looked indestructible started to show cracks. And for Steve McQueen, that was unacceptable. To reveal his illness publicly would be to admit weakness, to destroy the myth he had spent a lifetime building. So he chose to hide it. Friends and colleagues later admitted that McQueen became even more reclusive in his final years. He pulled away from the spotlight, avoided public appearances, and carefully managed how often people saw him. When he did appear, he wore his signature sunglasses and carried himself with the same cool swagger, as if nothing had changed. But behind the scenes, he was suffering. The cause of his cancer remains part of the mystery. Some believe it was linked to asbestos exposure, possibly from the flame-retardant suits he wore while racing cars and motorcycles. Others point to his time in the military, where asbestos was used in ships and barracks. Whatever the source, McQueen himself seemed convinced it was tied to his dangerous lifestyle, as though the very risks he embraced had finally caught up with him. What makes this secret so chilling is the way he tried to fight it. McQueen refused to rely solely on conventional medicine. Distrustful of doctors and desperate for hope, he turned to unconventional treatments in Mexico, far from Hollywood's watchful eye. Reports of those treatments, ranging from vitamin injections to unproven therapies, only added to the myth of McQueen's final days. It was as if the king of cool was trying to outrun death the same way he had outrun his rivals, recklessly, defiantly, and on his own terms. But the truth was brutal. No amount of money, fame, or rebellion could shield him from what was happening inside his body. And yet, until the very end, McQueen worked to keep the full extent of his illness hidden from the world. Fans who watched his final films had no idea that their hero was in pain, that the legend they saw on screen was fading. When the news finally broke in November of 1980 that Steve McQueen had died at just 50 years old, the shock was immediate. To his fans, it felt impossible. How could the most indestructible man in Hollywood be gone so suddenly? The answer was simple, because McQueen had kept his greatest battle a secret. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want pity. He wanted to be remembered not as a sick man, but as the king of cool. And that choice left behind one final haunting legacy. Because when McQueen died, he didn't just leave behind his films, his cars, and his reputation. He left behind unanswered questions. What other secrets did he carry with him to the grave? What truths about his final days did Hollywood hide from the public? And why, after a life spent in the spotlight, did McQueen choose secrecy at the very end? One thing is certain, those secrets didn't vanish with him. They live on in the legend and in the mystery that surrounds his final chapter. Steve McQueen lived like a man who believed the rules didn't apply to him. On screen, he was untouchable. Off screen, he was unpredictable. He carried secrets about his affairs, his addictions, his enemies, and his final illness that revealed a man far more complicated than the Hollywood rebel audiences thought they knew. And maybe that's the greatest truth about Steve McQueen. His power wasn't just in the roles he played, but in the contradictions he embodied. He was fearless and afraid, cool and paranoid, loved and hated. He was a man who hid his weakness until the very end, because to him, mystery was power. More than 40 years after his death, those secrets haven't faded. They've only deepened the legend. The King of Cool remains untouchable, not because he had no flaws, but because he carried them to his grave, leaving the world to wonder what we never truly knew about Steve McQueen.